Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever felt like people are talking about you behind your back? Have you been betrayed, slandered, or criticized unfairly? It's painful, isn't it? But let me tell you something powerful today. You don't have to fight every battle. You don't have to defend yourself against every lie. God Himself will step in and silence those who speak against you. God's promise of protection is one of the most powerful assurances we have as believers. When people speak against you, criticize you, or try to undermine your character, it's easy to feel defenseless and vulnerable. But the truth is, you are not alone. God is your shield and your defender. The Bible is filled with examples of how God steps in to protect His people, not just from physical harm, but also from the damaging effects of false accusations and harmful words. His protection extends beyond the visible. It covers your reputation, your purpose, and even your emotional well-being. When David was being hunted by King Saul, he didn't retaliate or try to justify himself. He trusted in God's protection. Saul's jealousy and paranoia led him to pursue David relentlessly. But every time Saul plotted harm, God shielded David. In Psalm 91:4, David declares, "He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart." This image of God's protection is not passive, it's active and intentional. Just as a mother bird spreads her wings to cover her young from predators, God stretches His protection over you when others speak against you. It's important to understand that God's protection doesn't mean that people won't talk about you or try to harm you. It means that their efforts will not succeed in the way they intend. Isaiah 54:17 says, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue which rises against you in judgment, you shall condemn." Notice that it doesn't say weapons won't form. It says they won't prosper. People may talk, they may plot, and they may try to damage your name, but their efforts will ultimately fail because God's protection surrounds you. Sometimes God's protection looks like removing you from a harmful environment. Other times, it looks like giving you peace, even when the attacks continue. And often, it looks like God allowing the false accusations to play out, only for the truth to be revealed at the right time. Joseph's brothers spoke against him, sold him into slavery, and lied about him. But God's protection ensured that Joseph was not destroyed by their betrayal. In fact, God used their betrayal as a stepping stone to elevate Joseph to a position of power and influence in Egypt. What looked like a setback was actually God's setup for something greater. God's protection also includes emotional and spiritual shielding. Words have power. They can uplift or destroy, but when you are grounded in God's truth, the harsh words of others lose their sting. Proverbs 18:10 says, "The name of the Lord is a fortified tower. The righteous run to it and are safe." Running to God when you're under attack means resting in His truth rather than reacting to lies. People's opinions don't define you. God's word does. When you understand that God is your protector, you stop wasting time trying to explain yourself to people who are determined to misunderstand you. Trusting in God's protection means understanding that you don't have to fight every battle. You don't have to defend yourself against every rumor or accusation. God sees what's happening. He knows the truth. He knows the intentions behind the words being spoken. And at the right time, He will silence those voices. Your job is not to retaliate or prove yourself. Your job is to stay in faith, keep your heart pure, and let God handle the outcome. His protection is not just a shield from harm. It's a promise that no attack will succeed in the way your enemies intended. God will protect you, vindicate you, and elevate you. Not because you fought back, but because you trusted Him to fight for you. When people rise up against you, when false accusations are thrown at you, or when others try to undermine your reputation, the natural instinct is to defend yourself. You want to speak up, to prove your innocence, and to fight back against the lies. But there's a greater truth that we often overlook. God is your defender. You don't have to fight every battle on your own because God has already promised to fight for you. His defense is stronger than any argument you could make, and His justice is more powerful than any attempt to clear your name. Throughout Scripture, God repeatedly shows Himself as the defender of His people. When the Israelites were trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea, they panicked and cried out to Moses. But Moses spoke a powerful truth in Exodus 14:14. "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." God didn't need their strength or their strategy. He only needed their trust. And when they stood still, God parted the Red Sea and drowned their enemies behind them. The Israelites didn't have to lift a finger. God defended them completely. The same principle applies to your life today. When people criticize you or try to bring you down, you may feel like you need to explain yourself. You may want to respond to every false accusation, but God is saying, be still, let me handle this. His defense is not always immediate, but it is always effective. While others are busy trying to tarnish your name, God is working behind the scenes to reveal the truth. He knows how to expose lies, how to reverse false accusations, and how to elevate you in the presence of your enemies. David's life is a perfect example of God's role as a defender. King Saul was obsessed with destroying David, chasing him through caves and wilderness. Saul's jealousy drove him to fabricate lies and turn people against David. But David never retaliated. He didn't try to overthrow Saul or speak against him. Instead, David trusted in God's defense. In Psalm 303, David writes, "But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high." David understood that his defense was not in his own strength, but in God's protection and vindication. When people speak against you, their words may seem powerful at first. Lies and rumors can spread quickly, but God knows how to turn things around. He knows how to shut the mouths of those who oppose you. He knows how to bring the truth to light at the right time. Daniel was falsely accused and thrown into the lion's den. But Daniel didn't argue his case. He trusted in God. And what happened? God shut the mouth of the lions, and Daniel emerged unharmed. The very people who accused him were the ones who ended up facing judgment. God's defense often works in ways we can't see immediately. He may allow the accusations to persist for a while, not because he's ignoring you, but because he's setting the stage for a greater testimony. When Joseph's brothers betrayed him and sold him into slavery, it seemed like Joseph had been abandoned, but God was orchestrating every step. The betrayal was not the end of Joseph's story, it was the beginning of his rise to leadership in Egypt. What his brothers intended for harm, God used for good. Trusting God as your defender means letting go of the need to control the outcome. It means resisting the temptation to strike back or to prove yourself. It means standing in faith even when it looks like your enemies are winning. God sees every injustice. He hears every word spoken against you, and at the right time, he will act. He will silence the lies, vindicate your name, and elevate you in front of those who oppose you. Your job is to stay faithful, to keep your heart pure, and to trust that God's defense is stronger than any attack. When God steps in to defend you, no weapon, no word formed against you will stand. There is incredible strength in silence, especially when God is the one orchestrating it. When people speak against you, when they criticize you, or when they try to tear you down with their words, the natural response is to defend yourself. You want to explain, to argue, to clear your name. But there is a higher way, a way that requires faith and trust in God's justice. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. When you remain silent and trust God, he steps in and does what you cannot do. He has a way of silencing your enemies, exposing the truth, and vindicating you without you ever having to say a word. Jesus himself demonstrated the power of silence in the most profound way. When he was falsely accused before Pilate, the religious leaders hurled lies and accusations at him. They mocked him, spit on him, and twisted his words. Pilate was amazed because despite the onslaught of false accusations, Jesus remained silent. Isaiah 53:7 prophesied about this moment, saying, "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth." Jesus knew that his defense was not in human arguments. His defense was in God's perfect plan. His silence was not weakness. It was strength under control. When you refuse to engage with those who speak against you, you are not being weak. You are exercising a higher level of strength. Anyone can react. Anyone can fight back. But it takes spiritual maturity to stay quiet and let God handle it. Proverbs 17:28 says, "Even fools are thought wise if they keep silent, and discerning if they hold their tongues." Silence can be a powerful weapon because it shifts the battle from your hands to God's hands. When you stop defending yourself, you make room for God to defend you. Daniel experienced the power of silence when he was thrown into the lion's den. He didn't scream or beg for his life. He trusted God completely, and in response to his quiet faith, God shut the mouths of the lions. Daniel's silence was not weakness. It was a statement of faith. He knew that God would handle the situation far better than he ever could. And because of his trust, God not only protected Daniel, but also silenced his accusers. Sometimes the loudest response you can give your critics is your silence. When people lie about you, when they try to tarnish your reputation, or when they try to drag your name through the mud, don't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Your silence will confuse them. It will disarm them. But more importantly, it will allow God to work. He knows how to bring the truth to light in his perfect timing. Joseph's brothers plotted against him and sold him into slavery. They thought they had ruined his future. But Joseph didn't waste time trying to chase down his brothers and explain himself. He stayed quiet and trusted God. Years later, when his brother stood before him, not only did God vindicate Joseph, but he elevated him to a position of power and influence. The very people who spoke against him had to bow before him. Joseph didn't need to say a word. God's favor spoke for him. The power of silence is that it allows God to have the final word. Your enemies may be loud for a season. They may spread rumors, twist the truth, and try to harm your reputation. But if you stay in faith and keep quiet, God will speak for you. He will silence the critics. He will bring the truth to light. He will make sure that those who try to harm you will have to watch as he blesses and elevates you. Let them talk, but stay quiet. Let them plot, but stay still. God's voice will be louder than any accusation, and his justice will be more powerful than any attack. Your silence, paired with God's defense, will speak louder than any argument you could ever make. It's natural to want to respond when someone speaks against you, when you are criticized, misjudged, or falsely accused. The immediate human response is to defend yourself, to set the record straight, and to make sure others know the truth. But faith calls you to a different response. It calls you to trust God rather than react in the flesh. When you choose faith over reaction, you shift the battle from your hands into God's hands. You are saying, God, I trust you to handle this better than I can. That is not weakness. It is spiritual strength and maturity. Faith requires restraint when your emotions are screaming for action. David understood this principle deeply. When King Saul was hunting him down out of jealousy, David had multiple opportunities to strike back and defend himself. In one moment, David even found Saul asleep and could have killed him easily. But David said, I will not lay my hand on the Lord's anointed. 1 Samuel 24:6. David knew that God's justice would prevail. He knew that reacting in the moment might have satisfied his emotions, but it would have cost him God's favor. Instead of reacting, David trusted God's timing and allowed him to deal with Saul in his own way. David's faith in God's justice was stronger than his need for immediate vindication. Reacting to criticism often leads to regret. When you react impulsively, you may say things you wish you hadn't. You might make the situation worse instead of better. That's why Proverbs 29:11 says, fools give full vent to their rage, but the wise bring calm in the end. Faith keeps you calm when others are trying to provoke you. Faith keeps you steady when people are stirring up conflict. It takes more strength to stay quiet and trust God than it does to lash out. Reacting is easy, trusting is hard. But trusting is where the victory lies. When Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, he had every reason to react with bitterness and anger. He could have sought revenge when he finally rose to power in Egypt. But Joseph chose faith over reaction. He told his brothers in Genesis 50:20, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph understood that God had a plan even in the betrayal. If Joseph had reacted with bitterness or revenge, he could have missed out on the greater blessing that God was working behind the scenes. Faith allowed Joseph to see the bigger picture, that what his brothers meant for evil, God was using for good. Jesus also demonstrated perfect faith over reaction. When he was arrested, mocked, and beaten, he had every right to defend himself. He could have called down legions of angels to destroy his enemies, but he chose silence and faith. In Matthew 26:53-54, Jesus said, do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way? Jesus knew that reacting would satisfy the immediate situation but would disrupt the greater plan of salvation. His faith in the Father's plan was stronger than his desire to stop the suffering. Faith over reaction means trusting that God will make things right even when you feel misunderstood or misrepresented. It means holding your peace when your emotions are urging you to respond. It means believing that God will handle the situation better than you ever could. Romans 12:19 reminds us, do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. Faith means letting go of the need to control the outcome and trusting that God will bring justice in his perfect timing. When you choose faith over reaction, you align yourself with God's plan. You show that you trust him more than you trust your own ability to fix the situation. People may talk, they may plot, and they may try to bring you down, but your strength is in your stillness. Your power is in your restraint. God will fight for you. He will silence the lies, elevate you in due time, and make sure that those who spoke against you will see his hand on your life. Reaction may feel good in the moment, but faith will secure the victory in the end. Let God handle it. His justice will speak louder than any words you could ever say. When people speak against you, when you are misunderstood, misjudged, or falsely accused, the natural desire is to clear your name and prove your innocence. But as a believer, you don't have to fight for your own vindication. God has already promised that he will vindicate you. Vindication is more than just proving you are right. It's about God publicly showing that his hand is on your life. It's about him silencing your critics and elevating you in front of those who try to bring you down. God's vindication is not only about justice, it's about restoring your honor and proving that he was working for your good all along. Joseph's story is one of the clearest examples of divine vindication. His brothers betrayed him, threw him into a pit, and sold him into slavery. After years of suffering and false accusations, Joseph was placed in prison for a crime he didn't commit. But Joseph remained faithful. He didn't try to justify himself or fight for his freedom. He trusted God's plan even when it didn't make sense. And at the appointed time, God vindicated Joseph in a way that no one could have imagined. Joseph went from being a prisoner to being the second most powerful man in Egypt overnight. When his brothers came to him years later, needing food during a famine, Joseph didn't have to say, "I told you so." His position and success were evidence enough that God had vindicated him. Genesis 41:41 records Pharaoh's words to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." God's vindication didn't just restore Joseph's reputation, it elevated him beyond what anyone could have expected. David also experienced God's vindication when King Saul was hunting him down. Saul spread lies about David and turned people against him. David had the chance to kill Saul and take the throne by force, but he refused to touch God's anointed. Instead of taking matters into his own hands, David trusted God's timing and allowed him to handle the situation, and God did. After Saul's death, David was publicly anointed as king of Israel. The very people who had doubted him, accused him, and mocked him were the ones who eventually bowed to him as king. David didn't have to force his way to the throne. God's vindication elevated him at the right time. Psalm 23:05 declares, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows." God's vindication was not just about proving David right. It was about blessing him in full view of those who opposed him. God's vindication doesn't just clear your name, it elevates you. It shows that his favor was always on your life. Sometimes the delay in vindication is because God wants to make the outcome undeniable. If Joseph had been released from prison and lived a quiet life, that would have been justice, but it wouldn't have been vindication. Vindication happens when God makes it clear to everyone around you that his hand is on your life. It happens when the very people who doubted you have to acknowledge that God was working all along. Jesus experienced the ultimate vindication. When he was crucified, his enemies mocked him. They thought they had won. But 3 days later, God raised him from the dead, silencing his critics forever. Philippians 2:9. 9-11 says, "Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth." The very people who condemned Jesus were forced to witness his resurrection and glory. God's vindication wasn't just about proving Jesus right. It was about exalting him to a position where no one could deny his power and authority. Trusting God to vindicate you means releasing the need to prove yourself. It means understanding that God's justice is better than human justice. Isaiah 54:17 says, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue which rises against you in judgment you shall condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord." When God vindicates you, the very weapons formed against you will be turned back on your enemies. The very words spoken to harm you will be the platform that God uses to elevate you. God's vindication is not just about proving that you were right. It's about showing that he was always in control. He knows the right time and the right way to defend you. If you stay in faith and refuse to react in the flesh, God will step in. He will silence the voices that rose against you, expose the lies, and elevate you in front of those who tried to bring you down. When God vindicates you, there will be no question that his hand was on your life all along. But people meant for harm, God will turn for good. The very people who try to destroy you will have to watch as God blesses you. Stay faithful. Your vindication is coming. Trusting God's timing is one of the hardest tests of faith. When you're being falsely accused, criticized, or attacked, the natural desire is to want immediate justice. You want God to step in right away, clear your name, and make things right. But God doesn't always operate on our schedule. His timing is perfect, but it's not always immediate. That's where trust comes in. Trusting God's timing means believing that He sees everything that's happening, that He hears every false word spoken against you, and that He is working behind the scenes even when you can't see it. It means understanding that just because God hasn't acted yet doesn't mean He isn't going to act. He knows the perfect time to bring justice and vindication. Joseph's life is a powerful example of trusting God's timing. After being betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery, Joseph spent years in difficult circumstances. He was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and thrown into prison for a crime he didn't commit. From a human perspective, it looked like God had forgotten about him. But Joseph didn't lose faith. He remained faithful even when it seemed like nothing was changing. At one point, Joseph helped interpret a dream for Pharaoh's cupbearer and asked him to remember him, but the cupbearer forgot about Joseph for 2 more years. That delay wasn't a sign that God had abandoned Joseph. It was part of God's perfect timing. When the time was right, Pharaoh had a dream that no one could interpret, and the cupbearer finally remembered Joseph. Joseph was brought before Pharaoh, and in a single day, he was elevated from a prisoner to the second most powerful man in Egypt. The years of waiting were not wasted. They were preparation for the moment when God would elevate him. Genesis 41:46 says, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph's vindication didn't come immediately, but when it did, it was greater than anything he could have imagined. David also had to trust God's timing. He was anointed as king while he was still a young shepherd, but he didn't immediately ascend to the throne. For years, David had to live on the run, hiding from Saul, who was determined to kill him. David had opportunities to take the throne by force. He could have killed Saul when Saul was vulnerable, but David refused. He knew that God's promise would be fulfilled in God's time, not his own. Instead of rushing the process, David waited. And when Saul was finally removed, David's rise to the throne was not only peaceful, it was undeniable that God's hand had been on him the entire time. Psalm 27:14 reflects David's heart. Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord. Trusting God's timing also means understanding that delays are not denials. Just because something hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Sometimes God delays justice because He is setting the stage for a greater blessing. Jesus demonstrated this when He heard that His friend Lazarus was sick. Instead of rushing to heal him, Jesus waited until Lazarus had died. From a human perspective, it looked like Jesus was too late. But when Jesus arrived, He raised Lazarus from the dead, performing a miracle that was greater than healing. The delay wasn't neglect. It was a setup. For John 11:40 records Jesus saying, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" When you trust God's timing, you release the pressure to figure everything out. You stop trying to defend yourself, to force justice, or to make things happen. You rest in the truth that God sees the whole picture, not just the part you can see. Isaiah 60:22 says, "When the time is right, I, the Lord, will make it happen." God's timing is always tied to His greater purpose. If He allows a delay, it's because He's preparing something better than you could imagine. If He's allowing false accusations to persist, it's because He's setting the stage for a greater vindication. God is never late. He's not ignoring you. He hasn't forgotten about you. He is orchestrating every detail, aligning the right people and the right circumstances, so that when He steps in, it will be undeniable that His hand was behind it all. Trusting God's timing means surrendering your need to control the outcome. It means believing that even if nothing seems to be happening, God is working. He knows when to act, how to act, and who needs to be watching when He elevates you. Just like Joseph, David, and Jesus, your waiting is not wasted. It's positioning you for a greater victory. Stay in faith, stay patient, and trust that when God moves, His timing will be perfect. What seems delayed now will soon be revealed as God's strategic setup for a blessing greater than you could have asked for. God will silence those who speak against you, not in your timing, but in His perfect timing and in His perfect way. You don't have to fight every battle or defend yourself against every false word. God sees the injustice. He hears the accusations. He knows the truth, and He has already planned how He will vindicate you. The key is to remain still, to trust in His justice, and to resist the temptation to react in the flesh. Just like Joseph, David, and Jesus, your response should not be to fight back, but to trust that God is working behind the scenes. His silence does not mean inaction. It means He is setting the stage for a greater revelation of His power and favor in your life. Faith over reaction is not weakness. It is strength under control. It takes more courage to stay quiet and trust God than to lash out and try to fix things yourself. When you choose faith, you allow God to step in and fight for you. And when God fights for you, no weapon formed against you will prosper. He will not only clear your name, He will elevate you in front of those who spoke against you. God's vindication will leave no doubt that His hand is on your life. Trusting God's timing is the hardest part, but it's also where the greatest blessings are found. If He's allowing the delay, it's because He's setting you up for something greater than you could ask or imagine. When Joseph was released from prison and elevated to the second highest position in Egypt, it was clear that only God could have orchestrated such a turnaround. When David finally took the throne, it was evident that God's hand had been guiding him all along. And when Jesus rose from the dead, every doubt was silenced. His vindication was complete. The very people who criticized you, lied about you, and tried to tear you down will have to witness God's hand on your life. Psalm 23:05 says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." That's what God's vindication looks like. Not just clearing your name, but blessing you openly so that those who spoke against you have to acknowledge that it was God who raised you up. You don't need to strive, defend yourself, or prove your worth to anyone. Let God handle it. Stay in faith, hold your peace, and trust His process. His timing is perfect. His justice is sure. And when He acts, it will be greater, louder, and more undeniable than anything you could have done on your own. God is your defender, your vindicator, and your refuge. He will silence the voices, turn the situation around, and elevate you beyond what you imagined, because He always has the final word. Stay still, stay faithful, and let God fight for you. Your victory is already secured.